Well, yeah, so you write about how he Schifrin did like a kind of like a polemic about maybe 10 years after he'd been fired, really, uh kind of calling out names type of thing in the industry and all of that. And you were kind of saying it seemed like he maybe that wasn't even enough time, or he kind of needed more perspective, or he's too close to it emotionally. Do you feel like your book is in some way a continuation of his work?
It's a continuation of his work, and his work really stands for a lot of how people thought about conglomeration in publishing for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of fights about whether or not the debate since the 70s um, has been about whether conglomeration is good or bad, a kind of moral take on it, or an aesthetic take on it has been good or bad for
Sure.
books. And I tried as a scholar, I think it's important and valuable to be able to, I think polemics are important. And I think it's also valuable as a scholar to be able to step back from that and
Hmm.
say, let's investigate the implications of these changes. Let's see what happened if we pay close attention um, to how conglomeration shifted the work of editors and agents
Hmm.
and marketers and publicists, and let's start to look at the books that they've published, and let's start to analyze what's happening at scale, and let's look at some of those consequences without immediately jumping to the question of whether or not what's happened is good or bad.
Yeah, you definitely pulled that off. It's informational. It's here's it's not necessarily good or bad. It's different, right? I mean, is
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying is it's different, and here's how it's different. You break the book into basically five chapters and a conclusion. Early on, you again, please help with the word. You talk about the colophon as the
Colophon, yep.
colophon, right? This idea of the colophon is collective. What is the colophon, and how does that kind of connect to your book?
So colophon can mean two things. One, if you ever look at your bookshelves or go in a bookstore and look at the shelves and you look at the bottom of the books, the spines facing out to you, yeah, you can see that there's a little image down there on the bottom. And that image is the little logo for a press, but it's also called a colophon. And so for
Mm-hmm.
Columbia University Press, which published my book, it's a little geometric crown.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that image, that colophon, I make that symbolically important for big fiction, because one of the key things that I'm doing, one of my main interventions, one of my big hopes for the book, is that I'm able to change our sense of what an author is, what it means to be an author,
Mm-hmm.
and to put the author back into her context of the publishing industry that helps bring her books into the world. I think we overestimate, put outsize attention on
Hmm.
the figure of the author. And this is tied back to a kind of romanticism coming out of the actual romantic period,
Hmm.
where we have a kind of fantasy about individual genius
Sure.
and creativity that we want to valorize, that we love, that I love. I'm a sucker for it myself sometimes, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a myth.
Mm-hmm.
It's by and large a myth, and there are dozens of people who help bring the books that we read to life. And there are all sorts of forces that are shaping the kinds of ways people write, the kinds of stories they tell, the style with which they write. And those forces are deeply embedded in the colophon, in this
Mm-hmm.
system of marketing, editing,
Mm-hmm.
wholesaling, retailing, that has each of these has feedback loops that cycle back to all the figures earlier in the production process, including back to the author, who may or may not know. I think it's usually unconscious, but successful authors are able to internalize all of the different pressures of the publishing industry in order
Mm-hmm.
to write books that can successfully navigate that industry and all the figures with their various constraints who need to handle their books, help build them and get them to their audience. So it's a move from author to colophon. And my whole book is, the gambit is, what does it look like to read American literature through the colophon.
Mm.
How does Beloved look, or All the Pretty Horses, or Joan Didion's The Last Thing He Wanted, or Michael Crichton's um oh man, Disclosure,
Mm.
or Renata Adler's Speedboat, or Fight Club. What do these books look like if we read them through the colophon?
Right.
And I think it's revelatory and exciting to see what happens.
Yeah, so I mean, you picture Marquez supposedly was in Mexico going on vacation, had the ideas for 100 Years of Solitude, and turned the car back around and went and wrote, for 24 feverish hours, right? And Hemingway had a couple bottles of some alcohol, probably, right, and fueled his genius, and Wallace with his headband and all that. And you picture like you said, these romanticized ideals, but there's so many hands involved, right? Like so many.
That that's exactly right. And so that's what I try to do across the book is I open up these stories. I open up the stories of Infinite Jest, since we've been talking about Wallace in the introduction. I talk about Infinite Jest. I talk about his relationship to his agent. I talk about his editor, Michael Peace, who is now the executive at Hachette, one of the big five publishing houses. He was always, we think of David Foster Wallace as a pretty artsy writer. His
Mm-hmm.
editor, Michael Peach, was always a fairly commercial guy. He would do
Mm-hmm.
music biographies, and he was not interested in books that didn't sell a lot. He was pretty clear he wanted books that would be commercially successful. And this was a tension. Peach and Wallace, from all accounts, got along well and had a good professional relationship. But
Mm-hmm.
it was also like a struggle and a contention because the two of them had different priorities. Wallace talks about this in letters, and you can find stuff in his archives about how the process of creating the book was in part a process through the struggle
Mm-hmm.
of navigating the demand, Michael Peach's demands to shape the book for Little Brown, who published it, and its commercial interest in making it a successful book, and Wallace's artistic vision. And it goes deeper and further than just the relationship between the agent, the editor, and Wallace. Wallace was publishing with Little Brown, which at the time was ultimately owned by Time Warner,
Right.
which was then the world's largest entertainment conglomerate. And Infinite Jest is a novel about entertainment at its core and the danger of entertainment to the American nation. And his book was published by the greatest purveyor of entertainment, which was not something that was lost on David Foster Wallace. He was well aware of the fact that he was doing this, and the head of Time Warner in the years when David Foster Wallace was writing Infinite Jest was talking about like devices, like proto YouTube devices to install in people's homes, which is also a device that Wallace writes about satirically in Infinite Jest. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this tension that he's fighting about with his editor. There's also these tensions that he's dealing with artistically in the book, having to do with the ownership of the publishing house with which he's publishing it. And all of this is shaping the book itself. And I think it's a really epic and wonderful story that deepens our experience of the novel. And it's not just Wallace in his headband sitting alone with his
Mm-hmm.
slobbering dogs, trying to come up with like disembodied genius that of a story that he can tell that will blow our
That
minds.
only he can tell, right?
He's down there in the muck and the mud with all these other figures in the publishing industry, and it's
Mm-hmm.
out of that contest
Mm.
with Time Warner, and it's out of that contest with Michael Peace that the book finds its shape.
Yeah, and that DT Max biography, I do remember so much about those letters back and forth, and oh man, I think writing to maybe to Franzen, Jonathan Franzen, and oh man, he took this out, and I wanted to keep this, and just all that back and forth. And yeah, I mean, geez, the meta levels of that book, like you said, with Time Warner being the one to promote a book that's about what, like, infinite pleasure. You like, well, didn't you say that? Didn't you write in the book that one of like the cards or promotional things they passed out said that the book was going to give you infinite pleasure? which is
Yeah,
the
no,
whole
this
thing
was
of the
this was
book.
this was the hype campaign. This was the publicity campaign for
Yeah.
Infinite Jest, which like it was very successful. It was
Hmm.
they were trying to get the, you know, Michael Peach wanted everyone to buy the book. And so they did this hype campaign to start passing out little cards to bookstores and publicists long ahead of time, where they give, like, you know, they do a series of these, and they promise infinite this, infinite that, promise infinite pleasure.
Mm.
And to promise infinite pleasure from Infinite Jest is the, you know, the exactly the thing that Wallace didn't want to,
Mm.
he was warning against. So
Right.
you've got this, you know, all the way from the beginning to the end. It's a book that's built and conceived and produced through these tensions.
Hmm. Well, I mean, it's ironic that, you know, he's known as such like an iconoclast and eccentric and all that, and we wouldn't have known about him unless the book was a popular blockbuster, which it was, right? Sold so many
Exactly,
copies.
and it was surely in part because of Peach's handling of it.
Hmm.
If Wallace had been left to his own devices without Peach and Little Brown, and wrote a book that was an extra, you know, 600 pages, and didn't get the marketing muscle of a
Mm.
major publisher with the world's largest conglomerate backing it, you know, who knows? It's hard to say. Maybe it would have found its way out anyway, but it's
Sure.
highly unlikely and probably would not have been the famous book that it is today.
Definitely. So I think so that part of the book I think is the end of the conclusion. The five chapters are, you know, the first two are about mass market, the third and fourth two trade, two about trade, the trade market, and then the last one's basically about W. Norton as it kind of stands on its own. And then with the conclusion, you know, with Amazon, the way it's changed the game, and Kindles, and kind of in recent years, um, in the I mean, excuse me, the chapters about mass market, you know, there's a lot in there, and throughout the whole book about this idea of like highbrow versus lowbrow. Like you said, middlebrow doesn't have to be a pejorative, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this whole idea of, you know, there's always going to be people, and I'm sure this goes for any sort of art, right? They say let's do you know, the mass market paperbacks, you know, sure, more people can buy them now after World War II and this and that, you know, more disposable income, but you know, it's lower level, you know, this idea of culture and creativity and you know, aesthetics and the elite. I wonder about you know, what you kind of in your studies, what you found about mass markets and the way that they were really again couched or promoted as for the common man in a good way and for the common man in a negative way.
Yeah, so they can be both, and really, what shaped this is economic history.
Mm-hmm.
There was a turn in the late '70s, early '80s, that where mass market books went from, there was a tendency to treat them more as democratizing
Mm-hmm.
literature for everyone, you know, high literature or whatever, knowledge, good, you know, great works for everyone. To in the late '70s, early '80s, making it more like let's kind of publish entertainment for the lowest common denominator. And the reason the reason why this happened has everything to do with the broad sweeps of economic history. After World War II, the United States saw one of the greatest periods, if not the greatest period, of capitalist growth in the history of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
The 1950s and 1960s were an extraordinary period of increasing broadly felt prosperity. And when that happened, that also coincided with the invention and expansion of mass market books. Before mass market books, which didn't really start growing until the 1940s in the US, it was hard for most people in the United States to find books. Bookstores were not super common outside of the East Coast. If you were in an East Coast city, there were plenty of bookstores. But if you lived in other parts of the country, if you were like a rural person, or if you lived in a, you know, mid-sized city in the heartland, you know, it might be hard to find a bookstore. And books weren't being, you know, shipped out like they until mass market books. They weren't being shipped out to, like, you know, railroad stations or drugstores. What they had were pulp magazines.
Mm-hmm.
So it was in the 1920s, 1930s, that's what most people in the country were reading, were pulp magazines if they wanted to read stories. And so it was with the mass market book in the 1940s that you started getting books shipped out to all those places across the country at a scale of hundreds of thousands, where books might sell 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 copies. Now they were selling 100,000, 150,000 copies, and they were being sold in these cheap things, cheap little pocketbooks. And those were the way some of those publishers were sending those out, was to try to bring William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway and Virginia Woolf to everyone. This democratizing impulse. And that was possible in an era when there was rising prosperity for everyone, when there were like dreams of greater leisure time, when the college was expanding rapidly. All the GI Bill soldiers were coming back and going to college. College was opening up to women and people of color. You had this vastly increasing pool of readers to read these books, and you had publishers who wanted to get great books in their hands. When the economy started closing down in the 70s with inflation and unemployment, and you had all these conglomerates coming in and buying these previously independent publishing companies and insisting that they need to make profits for shareholders, because shareholder value was newly this dominant mode of governance for large corporations. That trickled down to the way that publishers had to think about the mass market. You had people with less money because inflation was raising the price of books, and you had fewer people, had smaller discretionary budgets, and the readerships weren't growing like they had been in the 50s and 60s. And so how were you going to find ways to get people to pick up books? Well, they started shifting to a blockbuster model of big names. That's when Stephen King and Daniel Steele and Dean Koontz, these people who are still on the bestseller list today, they started being these names that you could count on for mass market sales in the late 70s and early 80s. And that's also when the genres of fantasy and romance exploded.
Yes.
Because you could get hack writers to write series books of fantasy and romance and put them in the newly expanding chain bookstores, your Walden Books and your B. Daltons, and sell them in ways that the serious books weren't selling. And so that's when mass market turned into a game of entertainment.
Yeah, it's like, what do they call them in Hollywood? Like bankable stars, right? Like, they're going to bring in a certain amount at the box office. Maybe that's changed now with streaming and all that, but yeah, Daniel Steele. I mean, the book is not, with the colophon, you obviously emphasize that it's not just about the author, but there's some really interesting. You do some really interesting biographatizing, if that's a word, giving details on the biographies. I just feel like she's been around since I've always known Danielle Steele. I've never read anything by her. You know what I mean? She's always been a part of the world. And
she's older than
story.
Both. She's right. Been writing since before either of us was born.
Exactly.
And I thought I thought she might as well be an invention. Like, until I started looking into her, I was like, Danielle Steele. Like, the name even seems so fantastical that it's like, is this even like a real person, or is this just kind of like a name that covers like a kind of factory or something? But like, she has this absolutely astounding life. I've become obsessed. I've become totally obsessed. I've read a lot of her books. And her life story is phenomenal, and she was manufactured as a star in the late 70s. And then she had to grapple with like becoming a brand. Stephen King too. Like, once these human beings, these writers with artistic ambitions who become brands, like, then become worried that they are only brands.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like you kind of hint at the fact it's almost like a Harper Lee thing, where she wrote like 6 books in a couple years ago, or 2016. Is
like Danielle Steele. Yeah, Danielle Steele. She's getting up there. She's, I don't know, she's not too old yet. She's still in her mid 70s, but like, I do mention, at the end, Go Set a Watchman to me is a real tragedy, because I don't think it's much more than a kind of subpart early draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. And Harper Lee, by most accounts, was not terribly with it when that came out. It seemed like a real opportunistic occasion to me. And and Danielle Steele's got a bizarre situation recently where for years she would publish 1 or 2 books a year, and then she cranked it up to 3, and then in the last just like 4 or 5 years, she's cranked it up to 6 and then 7. So
Wow.
she's now publishing 7 books a year. And I've read a few of these recent ones, and they are definitely not as good as some of her
Mm.
earlier stuff.
Mm.
I've since I finished writing the book, I've looked further into it, and I do think she's still writing them all herself.
Okay.
But I think I'm it's I don't know why she's doing it at the speed. I don't know what's going
Yeah.
on. But it's a fascinating situation.
Mm. You write really interestingly about the idea of like prizes, like historical fiction, maybe late 70s, early 80s, correct me if I'm wrong, really started to would start to win the awards, National Book Awards, and that kind of thing. And but it's this divergence where the Danielle Steels, for example, maybe not the most aesthetic if you're going to ask an intellectual or a high nose person or whatever, but those sell like hotcakes, as they would say back in the day. When the historical fiction, the ones that are maybe more for the critics, they're winning the awards, but they're not selling. I wonder if was there almost like a thumbing of the nose, like as in we're gonna like really exacerbate this divide between mass market, vox populi or whatever, and like the ones that win the awards.
Yeah, this is a phenomenon of that is, we would say in the academy, dialectical. So when
Mm,
which means that one situation is acting off another situation,
okay.
creating a third situation. It's these forces that are hitting each other. And so when, as we just talked about, when the mass market went lowbrow, became more about entertainment,
Hmm.
um, that and as publishing was increasingly feeling the pressures of the bottom line in the 70s and 80s, it created a fear among many literary types that there was not going to be space in the publishing industry anymore for what they would think of as serious work. And even the phrase that we now use for that serious work, literary fiction, which we're all familiar with as a phrase, was not a phrase that was used prior to the 1980s. It was a phrase
Mm,
that had to be invented in the 1980s to mark out this new space of distinction
sure.
separate from the mass market stuff. And that literary fiction is what you're talking about, the prize winning type books. And so this was sort of in response to the push to making literature like entertainment, was this push back to say, well, if that's going to be the case, then we're going to make clear that there's this different distinct space of prizes that is not going to be the same space as the high selling stuff. We're going to be a space that marks ourselves out
Mm,
specifically by not necessarily being the stuff that sells um, at the level of a Danielle Steele. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes you
sure.
get these crossovers that are great with sales and prestigious,
Hmm.
um, but they tend to define themselves against each other in that way.
And I mean, you think it's the same in music, right? You think of like I don't necessarily follow the Grammys or even the Oscars that much, but there's that year where it's like the movie that wins the Oscar, like nobody had seen it before. I mean, obviously not literally nobody, but this idea of the artistic merit versus what sells. As the book goes on, you kind of perch or kind of pose E.L. Doctorow as kind of like an in between, or as far as like kind of with a foot in kind of like the old world of publishing and the new world. You talk about that speech he gives, kind of talking about the decline of the publishing industry, but also he was prized, he was given prizes, and he also had at least one big time seller in ragtime, right? So I wonder just about Doctorow and kind of how he kind of bridged that gap, or you kind of bridge that gap between the high sales and the artistic merit, and also maybe even how ragtime showed that, manifested that.
Yeah. So it's this historical. He's a beautiful story because he helps illustrate the historical shift that I talk about in the book, where really the years right around 1980 are the divide between the old world of books and the new world of books, and we
Mm-hmm.
today live in the post 1980 world of books. And Ragtime was really the last great book of the old regime. So Ragtime, when it was published, was if not the best-selling book of 1975, was one of the very top-selling books of 1975. It was the lead title for Random House of the Year when Random House was has today was the biggest bookseller, was the biggest publisher in America, and it also did extremely well with the prizes. I believe it won the National Book Award, and that was kind of the cap of the post-war years, as I understand it. The time when there wasn't necessarily this deeply embedded distinction between highbrow and lowbrow, between sales and prestige. This was a moment where E.L. Doctorow could win it all. He could do all of the things, and really shortly after that, that all fell apart. So even just a few years later, you had John Irving, who I think it was The Hotel New Hampshire, was supposed to be a book like, he was supposed to be a figure like Doctorow, and his novel was supposed to be a book like Ragtime, and it was given a massive advance, and it didn't earn out, and it didn't even come close to earning out. And by the late 70s and early 80s, that's when all of the kind of economic history, the recession, the extreme rise in interest rates under Paul Volcker, the pressures that this brings on the conglomerate owners of publishing houses to make more money. All of this creates very quickly the changes that we were talking about in terms of the move to figures like Stephen King and Daniel Steele, and problems for writers like Doctorow. And so for a few years in the early 80s, it becomes quite difficult to publish these literary writers until Gary Fisketjon at Vintage Contemporaries, which is the paperback line of Random House, at Vintage, that is to say, created the series Vintage Contemporaries, where he published. He was trying to figure out, how can I get around this problem? How can I publish these great writers who have these books that aren't selling, that aren't being picked up and aren't being published, because it's really hard to sell literary fiction in hardcover right now, because Walden Books will only pick up books for their chains. If you're doing a total print run, they want to pick up 10%. They want to pick up at least 2,000 copies. And if you're not doing a print run of 20,000 copies, they're not going to pick up the book. And you're not printing literary fiction in hardcover at more than 5,000, 10,000. So he's trying to figure out, how can we actually get the E.L. Doctorow's back into business? And so that's where he comes up with the idea of, let's create this flashy series with MTV style covers, and let's sell them as paperback originals. Let's not go to hardcover. Let's do straight to paperback. That way we can do straight runs of 20,000, 30,000 off the bat. They can give them a real chance. So he does it with Jay McInerney, his college buddy from Williams. He does Jay McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City. It blows up. Everyone wants to do a paperback series after that, and that revivifies literary fiction for a time. But yeah, so anyway, Doctorow's Ragtime was like the last great book that succeeded on the old model.
In getting into like the trade chapters, really interesting to me was the idea of autofiction, which is as old as the world in some ways, but it was a place where women especially could, because of the sexism in the industry, which you definitely charted, in the boardroom, as well as like the sales and all that, but just a place, especially for women. You reference like Lurie and Hardwick, Philip Roth, who I'm late to the game on and kind of want to get into, but you write about how he was friends with sorry, remind me of Lurie's first name.
Ellison.
Right. They were friends, they were colleagues, but he was also very, I guess, contemptuous of her as a woman in some ways. I don't know if that's too strong of a word, but so just the idea that women found, I don't know, an escape, or a way to kind of point a finger at the industry, point a finger at society through autofiction. And in the same way, maybe not to the same extent, but writers of color as well, others who were discriminated against, or so I wonder about autofiction and how it kind of functioned, especially for women, people of color.
Yeah, so the industry in the 70s was super sexist, super sexist, and just outrageously white, both in terms of the people working in the publishing industry and the books on their lists. So through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the publishing lists of the fiction being published by the big corporate publishing houses, by by most counts was more than 90%, sometimes well more than 90% white, 95% white, really homogenous lists. So this has, real serious implications for the women and writers of color who wanted to write and the things that they could write. Women were expected to write women's fiction, maybe more sentimental fiction. Maybe they're supposed to be mystery authors or children's writers. And someone like Philip Roth or some of these editors at Random House, like Jason Epstein, they expected women who wanted to write prize-winning fiction or serious fiction to write like men. That was pretty much their explicit expectation. And so you have serious writers like Alison Lurie, or Renata Adler, or Elizabeth Hardwick, who were all published with Random House in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, who were trying to figure out how to navigate a world with all of these pressures and expectations on who they were and what they could do. And so autofiction, writing about very thinly veiled, if veiled at all, real life, was a way for them, but then calling it fiction was a way for them to expose some of the sexism of the industry, especially in the case of Alison Lurie's novel Real People, which is a fictionalized account of the writing colony Yaddo. And with Adler and Hardwick, with the novels Speedboat and Sleepless Nights, just incredible, beautiful, slim, crystalline novels that were challenging the form of the novel itself. They were using autofiction to channel a new kind of thought, a new kind of voice, a new kind of formal experimentation that was explicitly gendered, as a way to try to say, to try to kind of form a space, cut out a space for them to do something that was not necessarily what the men expected them to do. How could they be serious and a woman? And the autofiction gave them an avenue to do that work.
You talk about the industries being publishers being so homogeneous and so overwhelmingly white male. And so, throughout the book, like Toni Morrison, for example, and, but she's so damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Where she worked with Random House, right?
She did for many years.
Yeah, right. And so, even with that, so she's making inroads, right? I mean, she's obviously incredibly well acclaimed and well awarded and well deserved. But it was like, there were people who would say, oh, well, you're working for the machine, so to speak, right? You write about, some of the smaller presses and some of the nonprofits that come out in later years, which, seemingly do have more independence. But then also it was like, okay, well, who are the kind of writers of color maybe who are selling? Are they kind of being pigeonholed consciously or subconsciously by the publishers? Kind of again, danged if you do, danged if you don't. So that was really interesting. Percival Everett is one of those ones that I know is so well respected in the industry. I know Erasure, again, is like a meta type of book, right? Where it's an autofiction at the same time and all that. But just ideas of, I was thinking from the book, it does sound like a lot of these nonprofits, Grey Wolf, that was one I'm thinking of, right? In particular, they have really good missions and philosophies, but they're not going to break, this is the most obvious statement of the night, they're not going to break up racism and sexism with publishing, right? It's not enough. There's so many years of those isms that have forced some of them to, okay. So I think maybe kind of representative of that is the writer who was in, remind me of her name, please, who was kind of in conversation with Maxine Hong Kingston.
Yeah, Karen Yamashita.
Right. I wonder about maybe how her situations kind of show, as in anecdotal form, kind of show that kind of push and pull and that pressure on writers of color and women.
Absolutely. So writers of color in publishing have to, there are kind of thin pathways through which the
Mm-hmm.
publishing industry will, they expect certain kinds of performances from writers of color. And what those performances look like are different depending on if the publisher is a small nonprofit that is getting funded by philanthropists and foundations in the government, and has a little bit of freedom from some of the typical market constraints, or a big conglomerate press. So the big conglomerate presses tend to want a certain kind of performance of racial authenticity, perhaps a historical fiction, perhaps a kind of sentimental account of identity, identity formation. And the nonprofits, which is where Percival Everett and Karen Tay Yamashita found themselves, have a slightly different conditions that mean that these writers respond in different ways. What I mean by that is they have missions, as you said. A nonprofit press has a mission, and those missions for Coffee House Press, which published Yamashita, or Grey Wolf Press that published Everett, indicated their embrace of diversity or multiculturalism. And as soon as that becomes formally part of the mission of the publisher, then when they publish writers of color, and this is all great and as it should be, nevertheless, there's this structural inevitability. There's this inescapable effect that a writer of color becomes a token. They're a service because of their identity, in as much as for the work that they're writing. And so for Everett and Yamashita, they are highly aware of this, and they respond. There's two different ways that they and other writers of color at nonprofits have tended to respond to this scenario, and through the writing itself. And they tend to do one of two things, which is one, kind of satirize or ironize the condition of identity that they are performing, or look to the very conditions that make identity possible in the first place. Yamashita is a great case because she does both in two different books.
Right.
She has this book, Tropic of Orange, which is fantastic. I cannot recommend Tropic of Orange highly enough to your readers. It's a very, very funny Los Angeles novel, in the tradition of many other novels, perhaps most importantly, Nathaniel West's work, Day of the Locust. He's one of my favorite writers. It's a very funny novel, and in it, she just sends up the cultural politics of identity as an Asian American woman writer, but kind of laughing at the stories and expectations we place upon people given their identities throughout the novel. She really makes it, she really sends it up. And then in her next novel, I Hotel, which is a masterpiece, also extremely recommended. She turns away from that irony, and she goes back to the 60s and the moment when Asian American became an identity that people lived into, and the kind of contradictions inherent in when you take a continent of so many different countries and you place everyone that comes from that continent in a single identity. There's all sorts of complications and tensions and contradictions that follow from that. And thinking, what are the political implications, the personal, the aesthetic implications of this origin point of Asian American as an identity, is one of the many things that she does powerfully in the novel I Hotel. So yes, like, writers of color have learned to be extremely canny and creative in the ways they've dealt with the constraints placed upon them by the publishing industry, but the constraints are there.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, some of the tweets recently that have gone viral, and all the stats out there, that unfortunately, publishing is still a very white male industry. I can't say the word, white male dominated industry. And not much has changed. There have been small changes, but
it's gotten more. It's gotten more women have entered the publishing industry. Certainly there's still sexism in the industry, but more women have gained power, have positions of power, and have become editors compared to the 60s. That's changed a lot. But in terms of whiteness, yeah, it's still an extremely white industry.